Hello class, this is Timothy Halloran, and this is the 6th module of the Getting Stronger with Saturn in Capricorn course. I am very grateful to have the opportunity to share and present this material with you. Not only do I find it interesting and hopefully useful, but it's also been very important in my own life and journey in the past, and remains to be very important, an important process and practice in my own life. There are two main components of this module. There is the hour-long video, which you are listening to now, and there is as well an audio-recorded deconditioning tape. Now, I would like you to imagine that this module is a huge experiment. There is no correct or incorrect way to learn, study, apply, or absorb this material. Perhaps you want to begin with the deconditioning tape and just go with it and do it at a whim. Perhaps you want to learn the technical process and procedures and mechanics that goes into the tape first, which is following in this video. But it's most important that you respect your own pace and way of absorbing this information. And again, there is absolutely no right or wrong way to apply this information to your life. Please, at any point in watching this video, if you feel overwhelmed or if you feel any amount of information overload, don't worry. Take a nice big breath and feel free to either move on and let go and maybe come back to the information at a later time and just breathe in what feels natural and what you're ready for now. Or you're more than welcome, of course, to post any questions that you have about this module in the Saturn question and answer forum, and I'd be happy to answer any questions for you. But again, there's a lot of information in this video, and it's not necessary to know every single iota of the technical, mechanical procedures going into this process. And so feel free to absorb and go at your own pace. And I hope that you can enjoy this material in this module as well.
Saturn is conditioning and deconditioning. But what do these words mean? Deconditioning is a term that can mean a number of different things across a number of different practices, including physiology, psychiatry, and psychology. But to begin with, what is conditioning? According to the Encyclopedia Britannica, conditioning is a behavioral process whereby a response becomes more frequent or more predictable in a given environment as a result of reinforcement, with reinforcement typically being a stimulus or reward for a desired response. So force, reinforcement, this is a Saturn word. And so conditioning is a repeated response due to a particular condition that makes that basically set in stone. It is a programming that is the result of repeated rewards or circumstances happening in a particular and predictable way. And so what is deconditioning? From the dictionary, in reference to psychiatry, deconditioning is the reform or reversal of previously conditioned behavior. And so deconditioning is an important process in our human lives in terms of evolution and growth, as well as functioning in society. And the world-renowned astrologer Dane Rudhyar focused a lot on deconditioning in his various writings, as well as his music, poetry, and art. I would say that Dane Rudhyar is a pioneer of the deconditioning process. And he's actually most renowned for his contributions to music in how much he reformed music and was a pioneer of how music can be, how it can function the rules and regulations of music. But Dane Rudhyar applied deconditioning to being important in nearly all of our functioning and processes as human beings. And according to Dane Rudhyar, deconditioning is the first phase of a process of transformation. And he says it is valuable for us to pass through a period of deconditioning during which we free ourselves from bondage to stereotypes, taboos, preconceptions, and prejudices coming from our given culture. Now, Dane Rudhyar is specific to phrase deconditioning not being an end in itself. In other words, deconditioning is not the transformation itself. It is the first phase of the process of transformation, what really leads us up to and prepares us for the process of transformation. And so he writes that we are only deconditioned so that way we can be free to find our own way, and the way that is most fruitful, the way that is most fruitful, the way that is most in line with the future, the way of wheat instead of weeds. And so deconditioning is opening us up to the possibility of transformation. Now here is our old man Saturn, Mr. Saturn. And we're going to just begin by reviewing some Saturnarian words. So who is Saturn? What is Saturn in astrology, in our lives, in the birth chart? Again, Saturn is our conditioning, what we were taught that served to construct an underlying foundation for our own identity, as well as our role in the world, giving us a sense of purpose, meaning, duty, and obligation as to what it means to be a human being. And so, in other words, Saturn gives us definition. And definition can only be made by creating limitations that allow us to discern who we actually are and what we are actually practically doing in the world. Saturn represents culture, tradition, and education. And as we can see, the classic graduate's cap is actually a symbol for Saturn, this black square or the black cube. And when we graduate from a prestigious institution of education, we are crowned by the mastery of Saturn with the graduate's cap. So Saturn also represents institutions, organizations, the church, and specifically the church, not religion, but the container and foundation for religion. Saturn represents governments, laws, and consequences, which of course deals with the realm of karma. Saturn governs our accountability for our own responsibilities, particularly to the world, and particularly as mature and capable adults. All of these things are necessary for our own survival and perseverance as a species on this planet. And yet, all of these same principles can become huge obstacles for us to overcome if we do not undertake the integral process of deconditioning. And so between conditioning and deconditioning, what we're understanding is that there's really a connection. They're really both one and the same, two poles along the same line. And this very same thing, which can be used to serve us in our own building ourselves up, becoming strong, being trained, being educated, and overcoming the hurdles in our life, well, those very things, those very circumstances and conditions can become the next hurdle in which to overcome. And so here he is, Saturn. structure, skeletal framework, the building blocks of our three-dimensional reality, the cornerstone for our foundation, and the container for our experience here on Earth. Saturn is time himself, the great mechanical hands which governs the laws, rules, and regulations of this creation. And yet, is time static, unbudging, unchanging? Is life on this planet unbudging and unchanging? Do even our own rock-like skeletal structure, our spine, skull, and bones, do they remain exactly conditioned to their original size and shape from the moment we are born to the moment that we die? And of course, the answer is no. Things do change, and the mechanical hands of time move. And particularly when we're studying the mechanical hands of the planets in their circumambulation around the Earth, we notice that these hands oftentimes roll back as well. And so whenever Saturn is retrograde, and maybe particularly stationing retrograde, the planet of conditions is going through a phase of deconditioning. So Saturn retrograde is a symbol of deconditioning, rolling back an original set of conditions that we have already been conditioned by. And so if you have Saturn retrograde in your own natal chart, your entire life has had an underlying thread of deconditioning, rolling back the set of conditions, cultural prescriptions, expectations, and obligations that we primarily received early on in our life, likely from parents, authorities, and the traditions that we were assigned, the original set of circumstances. Saturn retrograde is deconditioning, rolling back these original set of circumstances. And Saturn turns retrograde often. When we look at him through time, he does something like this. Saturn is retrograde 36 to 38% of the time. Just over 1/3 of his cycle in relationship to the Earth is spent rolling backwards. And so this is 4 to 4.5 months of every year. Saturn is retrograde, and we're going through a phase of deconditioning. So here he is once again. And by the way, I keep referring to old man Saturn because that is the traditional personality of who Saturn is. But of course, this in itself is a set of conditions that you may personally want to decondition through your own personal relationship to Saturn. So I keep referring to old man Saturn, but maybe it's a Mrs. Saturn to you, or Saturn that's something different, Saturn the Capricorn, whatever it may be. So anyways, I'm using an old archetype for the position of providing background. But this can also be a part of your own personal deconditioning process. Now, very interesting hearing this phrase, this line from a poem. And this is from the poem Saturnalia, written by the poet Lucian of Samosata from the 2nd century AD. And Saturn is saying, during my week of Saturnalia, Sirius is barred. No business is allowed, drinking and being drunk, noise and games of dice, appointing of kings and feasting of slaves, singing naked, clapping, and of course the occasional ducking of corked faces in icy water. Such are the functions over which I preside. Now that's very interesting, isn't it? Because again, when we think of traditional, stereotypical old man Saturn, this is exactly contrary to the stereotypical Saturn. And yet, the Romans who celebrated and worshipped Saturn as one of their primary gods gave him an entire week of celebrating that is essentially the antithesis of this stereotype. And so here are the Romans celebrating during their 7-day celebration of Saturnalia. And so, of course, 7 is Saturn's number, and Saturn rules Saturday. And it is amazing that the entire Roman, basically, continent at the time that it was a massive empire basically shut down in order to celebrate 7 days of partying. And considering how the Romans like to party, it probably makes our contemporary St. Patrick's Day or football celebrations look more like a field trip to the library. I mean, these guys had massive orgies. They broke all the rules. Women dressed in men's clothes, men dressed in women's clothes. Slaves were treated. Masters served their slaves. They flipped all the rules around. That's interesting, considering this is Saturnalia. And so Saturn deals with negation. Negative is a Saturn term, and Saturn deals with negation in more ways than just one. Saturn rules reductionist logic. I'm not going to believe it until the hard evidence is there. There better be proof that something exists. Otherwise, it doesn't exist at all. This is reductionist logic. Scrutinizing, dismissive, rejecting until proven. Punishment, negative reinforcement can be Saturn. Taking away our privileges. And what does this negative, limiting, rolling back and taking away negation do for us? This type of elimination can teach us to appreciate what we have, right? Saturn being the ruler of time teaches us to appreciate the time that we do have. And so not everything about negation is negative, but negativity is certainly a huge part of who Saturn is. And this may be why he had his week during the Roman paradigm celebrated by essentially just negating all of the typical roles and expectations in Roman society. Now, Saturn's certainly not the only planet that deals with negation. And Saturn has a very important relationship with the planet Uranus, who is also another planet that deals a lot with negation, as you can physically see. And so the sign of Aquarius, which is now ruled by Uranus in modern astrology, has up until his discovery in the 18th century always been ruled by Saturn. Saturn was the ruler of both Capricorn followed by Aquarius until Uranus was discovered. And again, there are some similarities, particularly between retrograde Saturn and Uranus. Again, Saturnalia celebrated very Aquarius, revolutionary types dynamics. And Uranus, too, as we clearly see, deals with negation, turning everything on its head, breaking the rules. And so the retrograde process of any planet is in itself correlated to Uranus, or when any planet is out of bounds. This is a Uranian effect. So Uranus is far more radical. Uranus is the future, whereas Saturn deals with the deconditioning that prepares us for the future. And Capricorn precedes Aquarius. So Uranus is groundbreaking revolution, awakening realization, and total liberation. Uranus is the liberation from the past and known. Deconditioning is preparing for the future and the unknown. Deconditioning is creating a structure and a foundation, which is Saturn, a container that is flexible enough to continue changing throughout time. And this is essential for our own strength and our own longevity. And so particularly the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which is an approximately 45-year cycle, is one of the most important cycles there is, because it deals with the relationship between the past, the present, the future. What we've known in the past, the original set of conditions, and how they are totally being revolutionized and liberated. So Uranus is the real rule breaker, right? Even his physical appearance, he's on his horizontal side, having something like 20-year summers, 20-year winters. He's the coldest planet in the solar system, even though he's not the farthest from the sun. All of his moons are named after English literature rather than Greek or Roman gods, as it is with the rest of the planets. So Uranus is the real groundbreaker. But Saturn is what actually allows us to anchor the innovative, brilliant future in the present. And so, again, the Saturn-Uranus cycle is very important. And whenever we see any aspects between Saturn and Uranus, whether they be in the current transiting planetary alignments or in any person's birth chart, there will always be themes of deconditioning. And so this flexibility, in order to be strong, in order to be long-lasting and surviving throughout time, is the relationship between Saturn and opening up to the future in Uranus. So what could be a more Saturnarian example than a skyscraper? And here we see the skyline of Toronto and these massive contemporary structures that ultimately depend upon Saturn, a solid foundation and a carefully calculated skeletal framework. And yet skyscrapers require the fullest of human ingenuity in able to withstand the passage of time, the shifting of the earth, and the forces of the winds. The skeletal system of a skyscraper must therefore be flexible and yielding, not too concrete or unbudging, otherwise the structure will fail and the building will fall. Similarly, the receptive quality of Capricorn and his ruler Saturn is what guarantees the success of any structure, any organization, tradition, or container. Just as Capricorn is a feminine sign, and the mystical Capricorn beast is a goat with a fish's tail, so we must be flexible and yielding like water, and integrate the sign directly opposite to Capricorn, ruled by Saturn, which is Cancer, ruled by the moon, in order to embody and manifest the highest potential of what Saturn can offer ourselves and the world. So now we'll explain the mechanics of how these work, how all of this works in relation to the zodiac. And if this is too much information or too overwhelming, do not worry. This is not necessary to understand in order to really gain the benefit of understanding the process of deconditioning. So do not worry. Do not be overstimulated. Let's just go on a journey together through the zodiac. So every zodiac sign has a ruler. And this is what we're taking a look at right now, is particularly the importance of polarity in being able to achieve the highest octave of any sign or planet. This is like the most all-pervasive term and most important thing that we as human beings are attempting to achieve, right? Is balance. Balance is the way to achieve the high octave of any sign or planet. So for example, let's take a look at Aries, ruled by Mars. Now, stereotypical negative Aries, the negative stereotype of Aries is what? Being too dominant, too forceful, too selfish, too instinctual, not including other people, being a daredevil, not worrying about the repercussions, going in one direction and not committing, just letting things go, bouncing from one exciting thing to the next exciting thing, adrenaline junkie, so on and so forth. And so if there is too much Mars that is not in balance with the rest of the zodiac, Aries and Mars becomes distorted. And this is what, like roid rage, right? And anger and frustration and an incapability to function around other people. And so too much Mars, too much Aries with no balance leads to what? Explosions. And the whole thing falls apart. And so the key to achieving the high octave of any sign and planet, again, is through harmony and balance. That is the holistic way to be healthy, to be integrated, and be to our greatest potential. So we're talking about Saturn. We're not talking about Mars. But Venus balances out Mars. That means that what? In order to be the warrior in the high octave, we're defending the harmony and the balance of life and nature, right? And we're defending truth and justice and equality. And so Mars in Aries is at the high octave when defending equality, justice, and balance. And similarly, we will see the high octave of Saturn is balanced out with the moon in Capricorn. And so what is Saturn? We've got to be strong. We've got to achieve things in the world. And yet if we are too forceful and have set the bar too high, that can lead to turmoil or insecurity or guilt or inadequacy. And so all such forcefulness needs to be balanced out with the openness, the receptivity, the emotional support, the delicate, gentle nurturance of the moon. And so whereas Saturn is preservation, the moon is openness. Saturn is forcefulness, balanced out by the moon, delicacy and flexibility. Saturn is emotional maturity in order to overcome the difficulties of the world without being dragged down, without being lost in our emotions or our subjective personal perspective. And yet we balance out emotional maturity and being strong by being emotionally vulnerable, by being open by what we're feeling, as to not suppress our feelings down, which leads to a catatonic crumbling and then disintegration. And so all reinforcement, again, must be balanced out by nurturance. And all big duties, worldly obligations, expectations, obligations, and physical demands need to be balanced out with inner security, intimate support, and emotional well-being. And so that's one way to achieve the high octave of any planet or sign, is to integrate the opposite polarity. But there is another force and function going around the zodiac, and that is the wheel of time itself, the actual influence of evolution. Everything is always moving. Everything is always flowing. We do not have eternal summers or winters. It is all a part of an underlying dance, symphony, harmony, and beauty. And so every zodiac sign is always naturally leading into the next sign in this infinite progression, this eternally upwardly spiraling progression of evolution. And so again, when we're looking at Saturn, we're dealing with Capricorn, and the sign which follows after Saturn is Aquarius, which in modern astrology is ruled by Uranus. And so what we're talking about here is that in order to achieve the high octave of Saturn, we need to incorporate the polarity of the moon, which is going to allow us to be yielding, flexible, receptive enough in order to make adjustments. Just like how any really Saturnarian process, like being an organizer or managing a company, requires us to be receptive of the components of that organization, the people that we're working with. If we're overly forceful and not listening or being receptive to the components of our organization, that can lead to rebellion and backfiring and things crumbling. And so integrating the polarity is also a way of preparing for the future of Aquarius, which means things can radically change, right? Like we said, Uranus is the future. Uranus is the unknown. Uranus is the ground-breaking liberator that removes us from everything we've known and everything we've understood before. And so the more that we fight against the grain of change, of evolution, of awakening and adjustments. The more that we try to stay frigid in just Saturn and Capricorn and forget about evolution, forget about the new possibilities, and we try to resist change and transformation, well, I bet you can expect what's going to happen then. Uranus blows Saturn up. Let's watch an instant replay of that amazing action event and animation. As Jeffrey Wolf Green said, the steel box is Saturn, and Uranus is the grenade that blows open the steel box. And so the idea is not to actually create a steel box, not one that is so unbudging and inflexible that it requires a grenade to remove the obstruction of Saturn if we are not creating the flexibility and adjustments in order to allow our structures to continue moving and changing. And again, just like being a good boss requires receptivity, and just how a skyscraper requires flexibility in order to stay strong, if we actually want to create or construct something with any longevity that will last a long time, we have to integrate flexibility and not be overly rigid. So let's talk about some examples of deconditioning so we can get a better sense of what this is all about. In order to really master something, and this is really important, this is a root key to deconditioning, changing our life, as well as magical principles. In order to really master something, after we learn it, after we get the education, after we put the hours into school and we pass the tests and we practice, then in order to truly master it, we have to forget all of these things. The forgetting process is integral to mastering something in a way that is actually natural. Natural means not forced. Natural means happening effortlessly and automatically. And so after we learn something, in order to master it, we must unlearn it. And so, for example, judges go to school to master the practice, customs, procedures, and traditions of being involved in judicial work. And yet, all such conditioning will fundamentally get in the way of a fair and unbiased discernment or trial. It is equally important, therefore, for judges to decondition everything they've learned after they get an education, in order to be empty of information bias going into a courtroom case. So that way they can be filled up with the actual circumstance in front of them instead of being tinted or colored by their past experiences. And maybe those experiences may be a bad interaction with somebody who looks similarly to the person on the defense, or maybe favoring the person who looks like a favorite college professor on the stand, etc. And so you understand how these conditions, which may form consciously or unconsciously, fundamentally get in the way of the judge's job of being freed from bias, so to be able to discern. So the job of the judge is to discern, a Saturn word, discern their own conditioning versus the actual fresh reality occurring in front of them in every unique case, in order to make the most fair and unbiased decisions. Now, when we're dealing with the world of spirituality, this is also very, very important. Again, in order to really master something, we learn it, we develop a practice, but we also have to unlearn it and unwind it in order for that practice to become natural. And of course, what could be more of a better practice of deconditioning than meditation, right? Meditation is the ultimate deconditioning practice, kind of. But even when we say meditation is a practice, it's starting to condition what meditation is. Meditation by the masters, they say it is natural. It's not a practice. It's not force. It is a state of being in which there are no conditions. Meditation is the process of coming into a state of being where there are no conditions. And this is so important for each and every one of us because our own brains are hardwired by our redundant conditioning experiences throughout life. And what they've proven is that through the practice of meditation, it opens up the branches and the hardwiring of our own brain so we can experience more than just the one path that we chisel out throughout our life, which can severely limit even our own experience of reality. Meditation is the process of opening up our experience of reality so we can have a more accurate and real and unbiased definition of what reality is. The same way as the judge rolls back his conditioning and prior experiences in order to be a fair judge, similarly, we have to decondition our spiritual practices, even what meditation means and is to us, in order to actually achieve what the goal of meditation is. And so in various spiritual practices, we learn about all of these dimensions, all of these levels, all of these labels, these special mantras. Oh, these ascension dates, and the age of Aquarius is coming, and this is what's happening, and these are these changes. And it's like, good, we learn all these very real, very helpful things, and now forget them. Because all of that information overload can lead to a serious development of biasness. Like, oh, this person's on that level, this person's in this evolutionary stage, this person is meditator, this person's not a meditator, this person is on the road of ascension, this person's not on the road of ascension, so on and so forth. It's very, very important that we lose all of these things when we gain them. And, you know, an obvious example is good boys and girls go to church on Sunday. Not necessarily, right? And so we need to decondition shame and guilt that can be associated with various spiritual practices. If your family says if you don't go to church on Sunday, you're a sinner, and that gets redundantly stated to you in your childhood, well, then if you end up missing a church, mass on Sunday, you're going to feel guilt. You're going to feel shame. And that's unnatural guilt and shame. That requires us to decondition those original set of experiences in order to come into a natural sense of what is right for us. Another example of this is what people who are very serious about spirituality often get into, which is a fear of the contemporary world. For example, I had friends who were Hare Krishna monks who live basically as if it were, 1000 BC. And it was just very difficult for them to function in the real world because there was so much fear about contemporary society because everything's messed up now, according to them, and everybody's on the path of materialism, so on and so forth. And they lived very prison-like, cloistered, sheltered lives as a result. And many of them suffered as a result of the shame and the guilt of living in the contemporary world in which we all live. We also need to decondition the false pride in order to associate with other people. If we're so triumphant about our particular practice or what we're doing, this makes it very difficult to approach other people. And so meditation and deconditioning is all about adapting to the present. That way, in whatever set of circumstances right in front of us, we can approach and we can address the circumstances in the present. Another common ancient spiritual saying and an example of spiritual, conditioning is the phrase, "I am not this body." This is a phrase that's been long said, particularly in the Eastern ancient practices, which originally in itself served the function of deconditioning. I mean, think about it, right? "I am not this body" serves the purpose of loosening our identification to just being a limiting form. where we think, oh, this is all that I am because this is the limit of my own sensation. This is where I'm seeing from. This is where I'm hearing from. So this must be all that there is. And so I am not this body is a common spiritual saying that is loosening our identification in order to open up with the boundless nature of our inherent consciousness, of our eternal and boundless nature, of which is a form of enlightenment in itself. But remember, this is deconditioning. This is not the actual awakening itself, right? You can't just say something and then it happens. You may have realized this. You can't just say, oh, I'm rich, and then you become rich. Similarly, you don't say, I am not this body, and you achieve that level of enlightenment of no longer being identified with the body, and instead being identified with our boundless, eternal nature of consciousness. No, the phrase, I am not this body, is a loosening up and preparing for that realization and awakening of our total consciousness. And so deconditioning is not the actual realization, which is the fundamental transformation. It prepares us for such transformation. Now, it's also important to point out the repeated phrase, I am not this body, also creates its own set of conditions. And so what we're going to be noticing from here on out likely is throughout our life, we're going through periods of conditioning and deconditioning, conditioning and deconditioning, the way Saturn moves through time, moving forward 2/3, 1/3 back, 2/3 forward, 1/3 back. And so I am not this body creates a new set of conditions. And the way that deconditioning works is to create a new set of conditions, which is the antithesis of the old, in order to neutralize the original set of conditions. And so the phrase, I am not this body, which is intended to liberate consciousness from limitation of identifying with a limited form, also open the propensity for a new limiting conditions to be formed, such as the misinterpretation that I am not this body, so the body is an illusion, or I am not this body, and so the body is not important. I am not this body, and so the body does not need to be cared for. And that's what? Creating another set of limiting conditions that will hurt us, imprison us, and need to be addressed. And so if we are in too much body is an illusion to the point where we're disassociated and not taking care of our body, then maybe we need to think of a new phrase to say, such as my body is my temple, or my body is my paradise, my body is my home, in order to neutralize those set of conditions that formed. And so deconditioning is a process that needs to happen all the time as we continue our curriculum being human beings in this school on Earth. We will always have to adapt, build, rolling back, moving forward, just like Saturn himself. And if we don't decondition our religions and spirituality, we can expect more comic strips like this one. It's also extremely, extremely important at this particular time to be deconditioning from our culture. And this is removing conditions that inhibits our natural way of being, due to expectations and obligations coming from our cultural assignments, or removing conditions that prevent us from participating in the rest of the world or society or other nations or other worlds or other societies. And so we need to loosen cultural expectations and obligations by creating space for evolution and improvement. Cultural standards oftentimes become a prejudice in themselves, taking the form of segregation of different ethnicities, different religions. But guess what? We are at the beginning of the age of Aquarius, which is about everything becoming interconnected. The whole world is becoming interconnected. And this is why Dane Rudhyar so much focused and wrote upon deconditioning, because he's saying, listen, this is the only way forward. And until we do this, everything will continue to blow up and fall apart. We aren't going to be able to interconnect and integrate with the rest of the world unless we loosen our own cultural conditioning, expectations, so on and so forth. Enough to be open to receiving and understanding different cultural backgrounds, different worlds. Another thing to decondition is nationalism, which is this expectation that you should put your country first. Be proud of your country because your country is the best. Well, that's another way of resisting interconnectivity with other countries and creating competitiveness, so on and so forth. And so it's not nationalism, it's about acceptance, accepting our culture. We don't want to just completely reject our culture. There's many problems in Western society, but do we want to completely reject Western society? Do we want anarchy and chaos and craziness? Probably not. There are good things that we're taking forward as well. And deconditioning is just the loosening to let go what should be let go of in order to create a space for what new things can come in. When it comes to paying our taxes, our worldly expectations, our job, money, finances, so on and so forth, this is an area where we experience a lot of limitation, pressure, crisis, feeling thrown under the bus, feeling completely overwhelmed. And yet, can we just throw these things away? Can we stop paying our taxes? Can we stop going to work? Can we stop participating in our culture or society? Absolutely not. Saturn's all about integrating ourselves with society. And yet, we don't have to let these things dictate over our lives either. And so, the Bible quote coming from Yeshua, Jesus, is give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He's speaking to a poor group of people having to pay their taxes, and they're devastated. And his recommendation is essentially, give the taxes to Caesar because you don't want to get thrown into prison. You don't want to have your life ruined by the pressures of society. And yet, give to him what is his because there's a lot else going on into your life. And so it's almost this pittance, give to Caesar what's Caesar's. That way, that does not sabotage our life or seduce all of our energy and our willpower into being drained because of these hang-ups in our culture, in our world. Just give what we need to give. That way we can have the container that is ours, that we are conditioning, that we are in control of. And so deconditioning is limiting and removing whatever we don't need from society, but giving what we do need to society in order to continue surviving, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Now, some rather fun examples of conditioning. And here's another example of some deconditioning we could all do. Being imprisoned by our screens, televisions, computers, and cell phones is certainly limiting our experience of reality and nature. But I like to think that Dada art is another great example of deconditioning. So here's some Dada art from the early 20th century. And again, think of deconditioning as preparing for transformation, preparing for the flexible, opening, lengthening, and stretching by negating, by contradicting what art is supposed to be is what the Dada movement is all about. And I like this example because think about how Saturnarian this art is. Think about how cold and dry, Saturn's makeup, cold and dry these artworks are. And they're starkly unexpected, It's like anticlimactic. People would come and expect these amazing artworks from all of these famous artists and contributors, and then they walk in and they get a signed, porta potty type thing, a signed toilet. Very Saturnarian, cold, dry, almost cynical. And the other key Saturn word is empty. You're expecting richness and you get this emptiness. And of course, the famous Dada work, The Treachery of Images, is a picture of a pipe, and underneath the words written, "This is not a pipe." Deconditioning. Things are not the way that you thought that they were. Andy Kaufman, who you may know, was a Dada comedian. sort of the only of his kind. And I just had to throw him in here because he's another great example of this anti-humor, anticlimactic emptiness. And we'll notice in a chart, of course, he is a Capricorn himself. His North Node's in Taurus, ruled by Venus in Capricorn, in an exact trine to Saturn retrograde. Andy Kaufman loved dead air. The absolute most scary thing to your average comedian. What every comedian fears is what Andy Kaufman loved. He loved dead air. He loved silence. He didn't try to make his audience laugh. Usually his audience left confused, didn't get the joke, and that's what he wanted. He wanted people to question, what is humor? What is comedy? He once had an entire audience walk out on him as he read the entire novel, The Great Gatsby, out loud over the course of many hours. And obviously he has a huge Uranus Aquarius influence as well. So when can deconditioning be utilized? When dealing with unhealthy habits, unwanted habits, phobias, or unnatural fears, reconstruction of childhood memories. For example, being attacked by a dog in early childhood and creating this conditioning where now every time we hear a dog or see a dog, it causes our heartbeat to raise and our temperature to raise. We want to roll back those original set of conditions to be liberated from that limited experience caused by the dog. Undoing programming from being involved in a cult, letting go of unhealthy or unwanted habits, which will largely address, times of day, where you're spending your time, people you're spending your time with, the places that you are. These are ways to decondition unhealthy or unwanted habits. Deconditioning personal sense of failure, shame, inadequacy, negative association to particular words. I have a good friend who experienced a lot of trauma in her childhood, and every time she hears the word blood, it makes her cringe. It actually causes pain through her body. She has very strong Capricorn, Saturn, and Virgo signatures in her chart, but it's actually the word blood that causes this response. And obviously you can imagine that's such a hindrance in life, or this is a word that's commonly used. Or deconditioning one's own negative self-image. And of course, the self-image is our moon. And so what do we need is moon medicine. Moon medicine is so essential to deconditioning. And what mood medicine is, and I put homeopathic in quotes, because it's this notion that profound effects can come from persistent minute doses. Physical effects can be caused that are profound, that create great changes. They can be caused by the slight, delicate, gentle, and subtle. And so again, whenever we're looking at our Saturn dynamics and we're addressing deconditioning, Saturn deals with world obligations, and we need to balance that out with intimate support. We need to be accountable for our actions, and yet we also need to accept our mistakes. We need to be assertive. When we have goals, we need to achieve them, such as, I have an addiction and I am going to be strong enough to overcome this addiction. But in order to do that, it cannot be overly forceful in a too cold and dry way that causes too much discomfort. Otherwise, it makes the addiction impossible to overcome. And so overcoming addiction must be gentle, nurturing, warm, caring, making sure we're comfortable, and that it is a natural, gradual, slight, and delicate process moving forward. That's very, very important in overcoming addictions. If we want to be accepted by other people in the world, are we just going to force ourselves into social circles? Look, I'm your friend. Look how awesome I am. Look at everything I can do. No, we have to be delicate, subtle, gentle. We must be our natural self. We must have emotional inward confidence, inner security to just show up as we are and feel comfortable in our own being, in our own flesh, in our own self-identification. And then we can be embraced by society or the social groups we want to bridge with. And as we can see, the planetary nodes of Jupiter, Pluto, Saturn, for all souls, is in Capricorn. And long story short, this is an actual way of discerning. This is astrology, reflecting back to us the long outstanding patterns of our collective history, has been favoring Saturn, like how Mars became distorted because it all became about Mars. Everything's been about physical security, longevity, the survival of the family crest, giving enough finances to our children, leaving money to our ancestors in order to perpetuate our family name, to survive in the world. It's a dog-eat-dog fight to survive. Our parents all tell us, you've got to grow up, you've got to toughen up. It's a tough world. You've got to force your way to success by putting in long, hard hours. And this creates many, 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 many problems on many, 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 many dimensions of our life. And so the medicine is moon medicine. The north nodes of Jupiter, Saturn, and Pluto is in Cancer. And what I'll be sharing with you as the medicine of Saturn and Capricorn is radical nurturance. And again, nurturance is a moon term. Radical is a Uranus term. Radical nurturance is identifying and deconditioning societal programming that prevents self-acceptance or causes catatonic frigidity through over-forcefulness. This is usually noticeable in a tightness in our being. This tightness, this forcefulness, this one way you have to do it now is often caused by a restricted sense of what we can do or who we can be due to our social responsibilities and the need to provide physical security that is dependable. AKA, we all have to have a job. Deconditioning the relationship between taking care of our emotional body, the moon, and our outer responsibilities and roles, Saturn, is to be able to be capable of doing both successfully without sacrificing either one. And so we must create a container for self-love that gives one the comfort to feel confident in being your own authority. You understand that relationship? In order to be an authority, you must be comfortable and confident in yourself. Then you can be an authority and make decisions for yourself. In order to be comfortable and confident in yourself, it's all about providing the self-love to be flexible and forgiving with your own standards of success, time limits, so to not overly impose self-created limits or defeatism. And so again, the balance is being persistent yet flexible, yielding to unforeseen changes, and adjusting to the tides of time. So this is our formula for deconditioning. And this is the same formula which I use to create the example deconditioning track included with this module. Now, this deconditioning track is an example. It is to explore deconditioning as it relates to Saturn through the various signs and various houses. The way that this formula essentially works is with these three main ingredients. First of all, the deconditioning tape is going to reassert, reaffirm, and reinforce what it is that our goals truly are, what it is that we are orientating ourselves towards, and what it is that we aspire to build and construct in our life. And so there will be reaffirmation into our own strength and to our own goals. But in order to successfully integrate these goals, and in order to successfully accomplish what we set off to do, we must feel comfortable inwardly. We must feel flexible, and we must be able to make adjustments along the way. And so many of the words used in the deconditioning tape serve the purpose of relaxation, making us feel relaxed, so to open and let go of what conditions we need to let go of, and be open and receptive to what new ideas or conditions we can bring in. And finally, there may also be a few words or phrases which serve the function of liberation, being humorous or even silly in a way that opens us up to new possibilities and the infinite potential of the future.
The Saturn Deconditioning audio recorded tape does take Saturn sequentially through the 12 signs and the 12 houses. This deconditioning tape is an example of deconditioning. Of course, there are nearly unlimited ways that we can apply deconditioning to our life. This is just one way, in a somewhat guided meditation-like format, to approach deconditioning and to apply new conditions to our life. Now, because this is a guided meditation-like tape, it is intended to be relaxing and to be somewhat of a flow. And again, it doesn't require much thinking or much focus. All it requires is you being comfortable where you are and being able to listen to the tape. And it may be useful to have headphones that you can listen to as well. Now, there is no breaking up or labeling of Saturn's movement through the different signs and houses in the recording itself as to not disturb the flow and the relaxing quality of the tape. And so I have included a small list that just lists out the times that Saturn is going through various signs or houses in the deconditioning tape. So you can take a look at your birth chart, see what house and what sign your Saturn is in, and then see what time in the deconditioning tape that there is a guided meditation-like process taking you through that particular type of deconditioning. Now again, this is an example because your homework, which is of course not really homework, but we're saying that it's homework, is for you to make your own deconditioning tape. And like we've been saying, there's no right or wrong way to do this deconditioning tape. It is your own experiment and your own exploration. But maybe there's some things you like in the deconditioning tape that you can take with you and apply your own words or phrases or sentences. And this is what the homework assignment is going to invite us to explore and experiment with. Another thing you may want to try out is to record your own tape that you can listen to. And you may even want to have somebody else record the script that you write. Somebody that you trust and are open to may even be more effective to listening to your own deconditioning tape. But I again invite you to have fun, to play with, and explore with these various chemicals and colors and various materials that we have to paint and play with our own process of deconditioning. And again, I thank you for the opportunity to share this material, and I wish you all the best on your own journey of exploration. Take care.